Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very highly accomplished and respected professional from the world of academia from Japan, Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Sato, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Professor Sato is the professor at the Ritsumeikan Pacific University in Japan. He's an expert in Japanese foreign and security policy, maritime affairs, US foreign policy and strategy, and international political economy. He has published more than 10 academic books and countless articles and book chapters in academic journals. So, sir, before we start talking about Quad, which is where I want to focus our conversation today, a few questions for you. What inspired you to move from studying law in Japan to pursuing international studies and political science in the US?
Well, my heart was in politics even when I was in high school,
Mhm.
but I went to study law because that's what my parents wanted me to.
Okay.
So after completing the bachelor degree, I was free to choose my own major. So I
Yeah.
switched to politics.
Hmm. Very interesting. And your work spans both academia and policy circles. How do you bridge the gap between research and practical policy making?
It was a lot of learning for me when I joined the Asia Pacific Center for Security Study as a
Mhm.
instructor to a group of policy practitioners, including diplomats, military officers, and government officials from customs, immigrations, police, coast guard, various branches
Mhm.
broadly defined as a security sector.
Mhm. Mhm.
And rather than just learning from books and theories, talking to them brought me a lot of on the ground kind of timely knowledge
Mhm.
and also a lot of behind the scenes deals between different parties, different countries.
Yeah,
So it made the learning of politics a lot more lively and exciting.
very interesting. And how did your early experiences teaching at universities across different countries shape your own academic perspective?
Yes, I started my part-time teaching at the University of Hawaii, but my first full-time job was with a small Japanese liberal arts college in Honolulu, Hawaii,
Hmm.
where we trained Japanese students in English environment
Hmm.
and prepared them for third-year transfer to uh, American universities,
Hmm.
including University of Hawaii and some other universities on the U.S. mainland. And that experience is actually very helpful for my current job. Uh, but in between, I was away from teaching Japanese students
Hmm.
and I was teaching at the University of Auckland. And Auckland students were really a top notch,
Yeah.
very well prepared, and very eager to learn.
Hmm.
And my job at the Asia Pacific Center, my students were actually practitioners,
Hmm.
and they were pretty much older than me. So for me, it was a lot of learning
Yeah.
experience as much as I was teaching something.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Yeah.
When I was reading about you, there are so many different topics I could have chosen to talk to you about. But today I thought I will speak to you about the Quad, which is India, Japan, USA, and Australia. And I wanted to talk to you about the relations of Quad with China. Uh, and my first question to you, Professor, is how has Japan's foreign and security policy shifted in recent years to adapt to regional challenges?
Mm. Well, I think during the last 10 years, Japan went through major changes,
Yes.
and the beginning of that change was, of course, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe
Yeah.
and his initiative to reinterpret the Article 9 of the Japanese constitutions
Mm-hmm.
and open the path for Japan to more actively participate in collective defense and
Mm.
collective security.
Right.
So the series of domestic legislations Abe accomplished
Mm.
made it possible for the self-defense forces to
Mm.
play more active roles in cooperation with another country's military,
Mm.
not limited to the United States, but friendly countries and pseudo allies
Mm.
like Australia,
Mm.
or maybe you might want to even argue UK is kind of following the Australian path of
Yeah.
closer ties
Mm.
with Japan. So, so that was a major change which started under Abe. But it's also interesting to note that Abe's predecessors have been modifying the path Abe laid out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Prime Minister Kishida added a global South dimension
Yeah.
to what Abe started.
Mm.
And I think Prime Minister Ishiba didn't have enough time to do much. His tenure is going to be very short.
Mm.
But I think depending on who comes into power next, the orientation Kishida laid out
Mm.
may have an enduring effect for the
Correct.
coming years.
Correct. Correct. Very well said. Uh, Tell me, sir, a little bit about your perspective on the Quad and what role does Japan play in shaping Quad's agenda given its pacifist constitution?
Mm. Well, as you know, the Quad idea was proposed by Prime Minister Abe when
Yeah.
he was visiting India.
Mm.
And when Abe visited the president-elect Trump in late 2016,
Mm.
he had a conversation with, well, maybe it was early January
Mm-hmm.
2017. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
he had a conversation with Trump. And there he again proposed the Quad idea. And Trump basically signed onto it. But since then, I think there has been a kind of tussle
Mm.
between the US and Japan
Yeah.
about the ownership of the concept.
Mm.
And between the US and Japan during Abe's tenure, it wasn't very obvious that there was some divergence.
Mm.
And I think the Japanese government did its best to cover up the divergence. But I think Kishida didn't hesitate to uh, make it more explicit.
Mm.
Japan's idea
Mm.
was not quite the same as the US version under the Trump administration.
Mm.
And for example, Kishida added the word, to the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
He said the free and open and prosperous Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
So FOIP became FOPIP under Kishida.
Okay. Right.
And this is a particular emphasis on kind of collective prosperity,
Mm.
economic prosperity,
Mm.
is the Kishida's way of telling the Southeast Asian countries and also India
Mm.
that we are not simply talking about anti-China military
Yeah.
containment networking, and it's broader than that.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, Japan has been instrumental in not only proposing the original concept,
Hmm.
but also trying to anchor the U.S. commitment to the concept without letting the U.S. completely dominate
Hmm.
it.
Absolutely. Well said. And how do you see the Quad balancing military cooperation with softer areas like infrastructure and climate change?
So I think in the military domain, the cooperation's somewhat limited, and among US, Japan, and Australia, things are moving quite smoothly. But with India,
Hmm.
the military exercises have been routinized, and the annual naval exercise participations
Hmm.
become the constant event.
Right.
But beyond that, there are many agenda which just stalled, including the sales of Japanese U-2 plane, seaplane to
Hmm.
India, which
Hmm.
didn't go anywhere.
Right.
And I think India's the domestic factors do matter in the pace of the bilateral
Correct.
cooperation between India, Japan, or
Yes.
India's cooperation with any other Quad partners.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. But therefore, a follow-up question for you, sir, is how does India's strategic autonomy impact its participation in the Quad?
I think that's a very important factor. I mean, India's non-aligned history
Hmm.
and balancing among many powers,
Yeah.
sort of like multipolar preference
Yeah.
is definitely playing a role in this development of Quad, and
Hmm.
or I should say, the limiting the development of
Hmm.
Quad.
Hmm.
So, for example, Japan and India, very friendly, exercising together and exchanging intelligence and so forth. But for example, when Japan was sending the bulletproof vest to Ukraine, Japan requested the landing of the plane in India.
Hmm.
India rejected.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it was in consideration to
Russia.
Russia's
Hmm.
position. And that kind of divergence will, I think, continue to surface from time to time.
Hmm.
But but sometimes, divergence from the U.S. is actually a shared characters between
Hmm.
Japan and India. For
Absolutely.
example,
Yeah.
the energy import from Russia
Hmm.
is, something both Japan and India have been somewhat reliant on.
Hmm.
And although Japan eventually joined the sanction,
Hmm.
Japan didn't immediately join when Russia declared
Yeah.
annexation of Crimea.
Hmm.
So, so that kind of things will, I think, be a common feature between India and Japan,
Very interesting.
divergence
Absolutely.
from the US.
Absolutely. But moving on then, sir, how significant is maritime cooperation between India and Japan for regional security?
I think India welcomes Japan's presence, more of Japan's presence
Yeah.
in the Indian Ocean region,
Yes.
but that's not so much for forming a containment against China,
Hmm.
but for the sake of keeping a good balance
Hmm.
among many parties, including the U.S.
Yes.
Navy,
Yes.
Russian Navy,
Hmm.
and Chinese Navy. You just cannot kick them out of the Indian Ocean.
Correct.
So, so they need to be balanced. And So in that sense, Japan is a welcome player for
Hmm.
India, in my observation.
Hmm.
But other things like, Japan has been liberalizing the arms transfer,
Hmm.
and Australian, the proposal to buy Japanese submarine didn't go well, but
Hmm.
the new the missile cruiser, the Mogami class, it's going to be purchased by Australia,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so this kind of arms deal is happening between Australia and Japan, but with India, I think India's indigenous production, a very strong preference for indigenous
Yeah.
production
Yeah.
development, will probably limit the cooperation in that domain.
Hmm. Absolutely. But then, what role, in your view, can India play in economic co-op and technology partnerships within the framework of Quad?
I think India is trying to take advantage of the divestment from China.
Hmm.
The US corporations, Japanese corporations, they're joining this limited delinking, economic delinking
Hmm.
from China,
Hmm.
and reinvesting some of the assets out of China
Hmm.
into Southeast Asia or South Asia. And for example, the chip
Yeah.
alliance is initially only targeting, export of most advanced semiconductor chips to
Hmm.
China.
Hmm.
But now it's going more and trying to basically deny the Chinese companies' production and export of uh, kind of low level, technologically low level, semiconductor products like
Hmm.
memory
Yeah.
chips. And other countries are
Hmm.
trying to pick up the memory chip
Hmm.
production
Yeah.
in the world market share.
Hmm.
And I think Indian companies are very keen on, stepping into that
Yeah.
market,
Hmm.
and Southeast Asian countries are also not only moving into memory chips, but also trying to be part of the manufacturing process,
Hmm.
and uh, you know the the printing of the circuit onto the
Correct.
wafer,
Yeah.
or you know there are many steps in chip production,
Yeah.
and only taking a small part in that process
Hmm.
is the opportunity to be closely linked with the US centered
Very
semiconductor
interesting.
economy.
Very interesting. What a great perspective. Thank you. My next question, sir, is how do US alliances in Asia differ from its European alliances in terms of structure and objectives?
Well, the structure wise, the Western Europe kind of expanding eastward
Hmm. Hmm.
has been part of the North Atlantic Treaty
Correct.
Organization, NATO,
Yeah.
and it's a collective defense, and the US is a part of this collective defense network. Whereas in Asia, there is no equivalent multilateral treaty
Yeah.
system like in Europe, but all treaties are bilateral. US Japan,
Hmm.
US Korea, US Philippines, US Australia, US Thailand, and the Quad is nowhere near NATO,
Hmm.
as we already talked about,
Yeah.
and, and neither AUKUS. AUKUS is more than a submarine deal, but
Yeah.
less than a multilateral
Correct.
alliance system,
Communication.
somewhere in between.
Very
So,
interesting.
so the system-wise, they're different. And the purpose is also different. NATO's primary threat is Russia,
Hmm.
whereas in Asia, the threats are primarily China,
Hmm.
although Russia is kind of making a comeback
Hmm.
into that scope.
Yeah. 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 That is true.
And also North Korea's the growing ties with Russia, and maybe we are seeing the rise of tripartite formation
Correct.
as a threat in East Asia.
Absolutely.
But
I
but
agree.
the purpose are somewhat different,
Hmm.
and also I think the threat perceptions are somewhat different too. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine really solidified the divergent images of Russia among the European countries
Hmm.
more than before.
Yes.
Whereas
Yes.
in Asia, I think some countries still don't see China as a major threat.
Correct.
And this divergence, especially within ASEAN bloc, is you know, is basically it's an obstacle if
Hmm.
you are talking about formation of a multilateral security treaty.
Absolutely. What, in your view, are the main drivers of China's maritime assertiveness in the East and in the South China Seas?
I think China has a long-term plan
Hmm.
of rivaling the U.S. Navy,
Yeah.
and as one of the Chinese admirals, commented some decades ago that you know we we take Hawaii West and you take Hawaii East.
I see.
So
Hmm.
I mean, Chinese were talking about splitting the Pacific
Yeah.
for kind of co-dominance,
Hmm.
and but to reach that, I think China's this first archipelagic line, second archipelagic line,
Hmm.
they're talking about incremental expansion.
Right.
And countries like Japan and East Asian littoral states will be,
Hmm.
if they don't do anything, they will be gradually swallowed into this,
Hmm.
the Chinese dominance.
Hmm. Very interesting. I have time for two more questions for you, sir. In your assessment, how might China's domestic challenges impact its foreign policy behavior in the Indo-Pacific?
That's a very good question.
Hmm.
I'm not the expert of China's domestic
Okay.
politics,
Hmm.
but even to my eyes, there are signs of
Absolutely.
instability
Yeah.
in China. And I think some are, China's own making,
Yeah.
the trying to maintain the authoritarian one-party rule is unstable in itself.
Hmm.
But partly because of the, U.S. Effort to limit China's access to the
Hmm.
global market,
Hmm.
which slowed down the Chinese economy.
Hmm.
So, and of course, poor handling of COVID
Yeah.
pandemic, and all those factors together, I think China is somewhat unstable now,
Hmm.
and the the current leadership is trying to hold on to power,
Right.
partly by diverting the people's attention to external issues.
Correct. 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 Very well said. And my last question, sir. What risks or challenges could undermine the long-term cohesion of Quad?
I think the US need to be very careful when it wants to push things. And if you push too hard, too far, too fast,
Yeah.
then the framework kind of collapses. The managing the expectation domestically is very important.
Yeah.
And second, I think India needs to think very carefully about its relationship with Russia and also with this what is it, the grouping of Russia, China, BRICS grouping, expanded BRICS grouping. And there are too many rogue partners in that expanded BRICS grouping. And, the bad friends will make India look bad too. So I think India needs to be very careful.
Right, right. But on that note, Professor Sato, I just want to say what an amazing conversation this has been. You have such depth of knowledge. I can just keep speaking to you and listening to all your deep knowledge about this, but unfortunately don't have more time. But I will reach out to you again for another conversation in a few months' time. Thank you for speaking to me and sharing so much knowledge and wisdom that you have. Thank you again, sir, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.